welcome everyone here. I'm very happy to introduce you to the last webinar of the advanced project concerning market access of advanced therapy medicinal products, ATMPs. So this session will be recorded for your information, and it is part of the advanced ATMP training program, which is a program that is focused on learning about advanced therapy medicinal products by making use of e-learning modules, webinars, as we have today this webinar, but also face-to-face workshops and career coaching trainings, which has been offered to PhD students, also early postdocs, and also other professionals in the field in English in the course of the last years. This advanced project has been set up by several partners. KU Leuven is one of the partners. There is other partners as well. IATRIS, the Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare, also the University of Ljubljana, the Institute for, the Institute Elevate, and some other institutes. And it has been co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. Also Takis Biotech has been part of it, as well as the Instituto from Santiago. This webinar is hosted by the KU Leuven. My name is Isabelle Huys. I'm from the Department of Pharmacology and from the group of Clinical Pharmacology and Pharmacotherapy. And we have today also the pleasure to welcome two PhD students, Alessandra Blonda and Thomas Desmet, who perform their PhD at our unit in the University of Leuven in Belgium. And we will talk about pricing and reimbursement of pharmaceuticals in general, and I will also shed a light on what are the challenges with respect to ATMPs. Alessandra will then take over and talk about managed entry agreements as a mechanism to address uncertainties in the market access of these complex medicines. And Thomas will talk about next evolutions in HTAi of ATMPs, and more specifically, he will discuss the EU joint clinical assessment that is on the plate. So let's start with the basics, pricing and reimbursement of pharmaceuticals in Belgium, and how is that going on? It would be good to start with the life cycle of a medicine that contains different phases, namely a phase of research and development, containing basic research, preclinical research, but also clinical research, where different questions need to be addressed, namely, does the therapy work, is it safe, and is it manufactured consistently, namely, is the quality sufficient? All that information will afterwards be necessary to be offered to the European Medicines Agency in order to get a regulatory approval. In the context of ATMPs, it is indeed the European Medicines Agency. A next step, in order to make these ATMPs available to patients, we enter the market access phase, where it is needed to assess whether the therapy is worth the money, what is the cost effectiveness of the therapy. And all that type of assessments currently occur at the national level. I told you that indeed Thomas will also explain certain parts of it, of the market access that can happen at the European level, but in any case, cost effectiveness occurs at the national level. And in Belgium, this is done by the National Institute of Health and Disability Insurance, which I will now explain you a little bit further. In that institution, we have a commission for reimbursement of medicines with different people that have voting and non-voting rights concerning different criteria that need to be assessed in order to reimburse a medication. Namely, we have in the reimbursement a particular process that needs to be followed. In the reimbursement procedure, there is a phase where there is an assessment of the health technology. So the health technology assessment here in red indicated. And that is followed by an appraisal phase, after which a decision is taken by the minister concerning reimbursement, yes or no. In parallel, there is as well a procedure for the pricing of the medication, which is governed by the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And what are now the criteria upon which reimbursement of medicines are based? These have been included in legislation in Belgium, as in other countries as well. And the criteria are the 5 following criteria: therapeutic added value, price and the level of reimbursement, the importance of the medication in the clinical practice, taking into account societal, but also other therapeutic needs, the budgetary impact, and as well the cost therapeutic value. Depending on whether a medication has been classified for the moment in class 1, class 2, or class 3, this elaborated clinical assessment will occur, taking into account several parameters. And therapeutic value is actually a very important aspect of this, of the reimbursement itself. So medications that are in class 1 have a proven added value compared to existing therapeutic alternatives. And that is indeed taken into account in view of the determination of the reimbursement level. That should be proportional to that proven added value. But other medications can add in class 2 not a proven added value, for which the reimbursement level then is not higher than the alternatives. And that is at the moment the system in Belgium. This can vary also in other countries. For some medications, conditions are still needed to be respected in terms of what is the length of the therapy, or at what dosage can the therapy be offered, to which patient populations, and so forth. We call this in Belgium the chapter 4 medications, for which a control mechanism is put in place where doctors need to maybe register certain aspects. And that is actually also an important aspect or door or mechanism, instruments maybe, to use in the future that type of procedure for real-world evidence generation, which might be interesting in the context of ATMPs, where several uncertainties need to be managed. But what is also very relevant for ATMPs is that when you look at these procedures, which I've just explained, at the end of the appraisal phase, some clinical but also budgetary uncertainties may remain. And then government can conclude a managed entry agreement between the company and then the government itself. And that is a topic that Alessandra will cover later, because especially in the context of advanced therapy medicinal products, this is a very important instrument. Where negotiations happen, where discussions need to take place, not very easy. And that's why collaboration between countries is very important. And I'm showing you here the Benelux initiative, where Belgium and the Netherlands are also collaborating with other countries in order to discuss certain issues with respect to the reimbursement and the reimbursement levels and so forth in these different negotiations. Because indeed, for ATMPs, there are a lot of challenges to be considered. These are very complex medications, and as you already know, there are different types of ATMPs. We have somatic cell therapies, we have gene therapies, tissue engineered products, or combination of it, sometimes also combined with medical devices. And whereby some of these therapies might claim even a cure. So we can also have some one-shot therapies like gene therapies, which are not just symptomatic treatments, but really can be a life changer. Several of these ATMPs have been approved today, and you see here gene therapies, cell-based therapies, tissue engineered products, but some of them also lost or have withdrawn their marketing authorization over the last years as well. And this is due to several, let's say, challenges which are there. So aside from the opportunities that these are very unique medicines that really can cure in certain instances based on just a single administration, a disease, with potentially long-term savings as well for these healthcare systems, since since other treatments don't need to be administered anymore, there might be long-term uncertainties with respect to the long-term benefits and the risks, because we don't know how they will perform on the long run, because clinical trials have just a particular length, and the upfront costs are very high also for healthcare systems. That is one thing. So at the regulatory approval, the European Medicines Agency approves these medications in many instances conditionally on a conditional marketing authorization, or sometimes also in an accelerated way, so an accelerated assessment process to make these therapies fast available. However, at a national level, where the pricing and the reimbursement occurs, still clinical uncertainties might remain, and still patient access might be impeded because patients have an heterogeneity compared to the clinical trial population. So that is something where the pricing and the health, where the national countries, so the countries need to deal with these long-term uncertainties on the one hand with respect to safety and efficacy, and then sometimes very high prices. Think of 300,000 to more than 2 million euros per treatment, which as countries we need to deal with in order to ensure that patients that need these medications can have access. And then we can think, okay, why are these high prices there? There are definitely certain drivers, and these drivers are indeed at place for companies, because we are talking here about very complex diseases, very rare diseases, often so small markets, where competition might be high, and where also a high value of medication so can be offered to these patients. Companies also have IP rights, intellectual property rights, on the basic technologies underlying these ATMPs, which give them also power, higher power in price negotiations. And then we have indeed the payer. Payer has, at the one hand, might have a willingness to pay for these medicines, but what with the society and what with the pressure that is put from the society as well on the countries and on the governments, and indeed on the long run, is this indeed sustainable? So very complex discussions which we should think about, and also think about solutions or approaches to address uncertainties and affordability. Some of them have been studied by others, and I list here some ideas. For instance, talking early dialogues, we call them, between the developers of these ATMPs and then regulatory authorities or payers, might offer early insights into what are the risks, what are the procedures to address the uncertainties. Making these dialogues obligatory could be a way to speed up these processes and give earlier clarity. Public-private partnerships early on in the drug development, where costs and as well risks are shared early on, might also contribute to an increase in the efficiency of the process. And then increased partnerships between payers at the national level. We have the Benelux initiative, but that indeed can be enlarged also by involving other countries, and harmonizing as well ideas and approaches for value assessment for the ATMPs. And what about transparency? Transparency at all levels, also about clinical trial results, which may then offer more insights into what is known about these medications, but that is already on a good run. And then indeed, is there a way to rethink intellectual property-based payment models? Some of them have already been worked out, so that is actually something which can be studied later on. But the way how countries nowadays manage or face the uncertainties related to ATMPs is by installing managed entry agreements. And that's the topic that Alessandra Blonda will talk about. And I am very happy to stop here sharing and that Alessandra can take over.
Yes, thank you, Isabelle. As mentioned, the upfront costs for ATMPs are often very high. But in the meantime, it's difficult for the reimbursement agency to determine whether the ATMP provides the added value that's claimed by the company, as data on the effectiveness and costs are often lacking. The reimbursement agency wants to avoid to deny access to a potentially valuable therapy, and for this reason, it will grant the ATMP a conditional reimbursement. This will also enable the company to gather more data on cost and effectiveness. Such a conditional reimbursement is facilitated by a managed entry agreement, and this is an agreement that is negotiated between representatives from the pharmaceutical company, Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Health. And such an agreement is confidential, meaning that its contents are not to be made public. They are also temporarily, usually providing an initial reimbursement of 3 years. There are two main types of managed entry agreements. First of all, there are the financial-based managed entry agreements, and these are implemented when, for instance, there are uncertainties on the real budget impact of the ATMP. For instance, there's uncertainty on how many patients are really eligible for treatment, what the market share of the ATMP will be, or maybe overall costs related to use, such as the treatment duration, the dosing, or the costs of associated therapies or complications. And also, oftentimes, there are uncertainties on the cost effectiveness, so the additional costs versus the additional benefit when compared to the current standard of care. The mechanisms included in a financial-based managed entry agreement are thus aimed at sharing the financial risk between the payer and the pharmaceutical company. They include measures such as a discount on the price, or maybe a budget cap, a volume cap, or on the level of the patients, maybe a utilization cap, for instance, a maximum amount of doses that's reimbursed, a maximum amount of time that the ATMP is reimbursed, or also a discount in the form of free doses or free treatment initiation. On a clinical level, uncertainties that lead to a managed entry agreement often concern the efficacy, because it's not clear whether there's any therapeutic value or what the therapeutic value is in certain subgroups, as well as the long-term data, which is sometimes a bit unclear, or the optimal treatment schemes, such as the duration of the treatment or which doses or drug combinations are optimal. Mechanisms to address these uncertainties can be implemented on a patient or a population level. For instance, there is a coverage with treatment continuation, where there is a reimbursement linked to the performance in an individual patient. Then there is a coverage with evidence development, which concerns a collection of real-world evidence in a disease or in a product registry. And then there are the pay-for-performance schemes, where upfront there is a linking of a specific payment or coverage condition on the performance or to the performance of the ATMP. And pay-for-performance schemes can, for instance, be an outcomes guarantee, for instance, a payment for responders only, or a refund for the non-responders, or maybe a reimbursement only for patients that reach a predefined and intermediate treatment milestone, or maybe a payment or reimbursement that's linked to practice patterns. Specifically in Belgium, we see a tendency towards financial-based managed entry agreements. Usually in 73% of the cases, they provide reimbursement on condition that a percentage of the turnover is reimbursed. To a lesser extent, companies are asked to refund a fixed amount per unit, or to refund when the expenditure of the payer towards the ATMP exceeds a certain predefined cost. In 14% of the cases, the managed entry agreement provides a combination of a financial with an outcomes-based measurement. For instance, the payer can ask the company to refund a percentage of the sales turnover of the ATMP, while varying that percentage according to the number of responders. However, there's overall little transparency on the specifics of the compensation mechanism that is agreed upon for a specific ATMP. In Belgium, the public parts of the managed entry agreements can be requested from the reimbursement agency. The document mentions the indication under the agreement, whether it concerns initial agreements or an amendment, such as a change in the reimbursement modalities, the addition of a package, the clinical budgetary uncertainties that are remaining at the time of conditional approval, and the duration of the agreements. However, the majority of the information in the managed entry agreement is kept from the public eye. For instance, in the case of a gene therapy called Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy, we know that the managed entry agreement provides a compensation mechanism that requests the reimbursement of a percentage of the revenue from the company, although we have no information about how high this percentage is and whether this percentage depends on other factors. In addition, the report indicates that a coverage with evidence development scheme is put in place by the collection of data in a registry. However, it does not define which data will be collected in order to answer the remaining uncertainties included in the managed entry agreements. Also, after the 3-year period of the agreement has ended, there is no public information on which real-world data or evidence was collected in order to answer the uncertainties, or on whether the uncertainties were answered at all. This lack of transparency has significant implications. First of all, since there is no transparency on the real price or the price in the agreements, this in turn inhibits the accurate cost-effectiveness analysis of a new ATMP, for instance, when its comparator is still reimbursed under the conditions of a managed entry agreement. It is also not possible for the taxpayer to determine whether the ATMP, albeit conditional reimbursed, provides value for money. And this in turn undermines the legitimacy of the reimbursement decision, which in the case of highly priced ATMPs may be highly controversial. And finally, it raises questions on equality, because efficient spending or inefficient spending may increase inequality when those funds are directed away from patients whose treatment may be more beneficial or whose treatment provides more added value. Another challenge lies in the fact that outcome-based managed entry agreements do not always succeed at solving the uncertainties included. First of all, outcome-based managed entry agreements are complex, especially when they are tied to financial provisions. Data collection and analysis are often quite costly and put a significant administrative burden on all stakeholders. And more importantly, many information systems are not yet adequately adapted for data collection. Also, the data that is collected is not always appropriate to address the uncertainties. And furthermore, a lack of transparency inhibits efficient data sharing between countries, which in turn may lead to a duplication of work and increases the costs even more. And finally, there is a need for clearer criteria to determine in which cases a coverage with evidence development scheme would be most appropriate. Recent Belgian data have shown that after expiry of the initial managed entry agreement, a definitive reimbursement is granted in only 29% of the cases. In all other cases, either a new managed entry agreement was concluded or no reimbursement was granted at all. And this implies that the managed entry agreements are not succeeding as a tool to provide a conditional reimbursement. For this reason, we can provide some recommendations on how to improve the practice of managed entry agreements and their implementation. For instance, decision makers should be more transparent, at least on the elements in favor or against reimbursement. The type of managed entry agreement should be tailored better to the uncertainty it aims to resolve, for instance, via a checklist, which can be found online from various sources and authors. Early dialogue is necessary between all stakeholders to discuss which type of data will be collected to solve which specific uncertainty. Clearer conditions are needed for renewing or not renewing a managed entry agreement, and they should be discussed early on in the process to avoid a disinvestment, for instance. We should agree maybe on a limited number of renewals and provide adequate resources to manage the re-evaluation. Also, there is a need for more transparency on the data that is considered during the re-evaluation, at least the clinical data. In this graph, we can see the cumulative compensations or refunds as provided by the companies for all specialties under convention in green. As a difference between the cumulative, so this is the difference between the cumulative gross turnover and the net turnover. And the graph shows that the refunds as provided in the context of managed entry agreements are increasing. In 2020, the compensations of the companies have accumulated till up to 30.5%. However, we should view these savings with caution. For instance, the discount may be high, but when the price of an ATMP is set 10 times too high, or when the product shows no or limited added value, this can also be an issue, and it makes no sense to just look at the refunds. For this reason, it's also important not to lose sight of the big picture and to take the recommendations as provided into account. And now I will give the words to Thomas Desmet, who will talk about the next evolutions in HTAi of ATMPs, the European Joint Clinical Assessments.
So thank you, Alessandra. So indeed, I will be talking about the joint clinical assessments, which entered into force in January 2022. And we are now in the preparatory phase until January 2025, where we will set up the coordination group, the stakeholder network, as well as draft implementing and delegating acts next to the guidance documents, in which I will delve into a bit deeper in this presentation, which are assigned to the UNETA Consortium 2021. So my research also positions within these joint clinical assessments. As you know, these HTAi regulations affect all of us, and instead of each member state conducting their own clinical assessment of an advanced therapy medicinal products in the first phase, and then later on also other medicines. This is very important to prepare also for Belgium in order to maneuver through this regulation and apply it to the best of the needs. So we will study the impact of the joint clinical assessments on Belgium, so the needed preparations and the challenges that will come with this regulation, because we will have to maybe rethink our reimbursement processes in order to apply the joint clinical assessment outcomes into this. And we will do this through semi-structured interviews with public authorities, UNETA, ATMP developers, HTAi bodies, and so on. So let me first give you a broad overview of what the UNETA HTAi core model is, which is also used in this joint clinical assessment framework. So on the left side, you can see that there is the rapid relative effectiveness assessment, which entails 4 aspects, which all handle about the clinical effectiveness of a drug, so as well as the safety and the description of the technical characteristics. And as you might know, this is the same for every country. So in this way, this will be done by UNETA on a European level. And then on the right side, you can see the national assessment or the appraisal domains. These are 5 domains listed. They are not in a specific ranking order, so the legal aspects are equally important as the cost and the economic effectiveness. So don't look at the ranking of these. And these aspects from the comprehensive full HTAi, they have to be carried out on a national level because, for example, the economic and the funding is very local and cannot be decided on a European level. So the joint clinical assessments in a national HTAi process. So first of all, we will have the jointly agreed PICOs, which I will delve into in some of the next slides, where we will have the drug assessed by a certain framework. And so the scientific analysis of the clinical effects and the scientific uncertainties will be listed and analyzed. And then if needed, complementary clinical analysis can be performed on a Belgian level. For example, if we have the cancer registry, which we will use to see what population in Belgium has a specific type of cancer. then we can use these data complementary to the data of the which comes out of the joint clinical assessment. And then next to it, then we have the non-clinical assessment, as I have previously mentioned. These will also be done on a national level and will be kept on a national level. And then taking all these into account, so the European assessment as well as the national assessment, we can draw our conclusions on a specific medicinal product, and the appraisal phase can start. So the focus of the joint clinical assessment until 2025 is on cancer medicines and ATMPs. So why would we focus on these therapies? Well, it was already previously mentioned by Professor Huys and Alessandra that these drugs are very innovative, and that we need some solutions to tackle the challenges that we face today. And as you can see on the slides, there is a big number. There's a big number of developers worldwide who are working with ATMPs. So to meet the needs of health technology bodies and decision makers and stakeholders, Belgium should be able to criticize the PICO, which I have previously mentioned, but not yet assigned to you what it is. So we will have to be able to criticize it, and in order to do so, we will have to do an analysis for ourselves in order to be able to criticize this. And the aim of the joint clinical assessment is to avoid duplications of work and align every member state in Europe on the pricing and reimbursement. And we will have to look into the different methodologies and the assessment criteria, which is also one of the working parts of the preparatory phase, which we are in now today. And the joint clinical assessment could start upon a positive CHMP decision, which is very beneficial for patients in that way that it can advance and accelerate patient access in this way. So here are some benefits listed of the HTAi regulations. So for member states, it will ensure high quality reports. It will support their evidence-based decision making. And for patients, it is also an improved transparency, since these joint reports will be more transparent than the national ones, in the same way that it is in English. So more people will be able to understand these reports and what is in them. And for the industry, it will also become a more clearer and a coherent clinical evidence requirement process, because the PICOs, which will be assigned in the first place, will enable them to look for what data they need in order to address the PICO from several member states. And in this way, we hope to come to a more efficient submission. So this is the scoping phase and the assessment phase. So first of all, there will be a topic which has to be identified. Next, the assessment team will be established, and patients as well as healthcare professionals will be involved into the process to define the PICO. And a PICO is more like a research question, which needs to be answered in order to see if certain drugs addresses a certain need. And then secondly, in the assessment phase, a first draft will be drafted, and this can be reviewed by all member states. So this is important, why Belgium has to already look into the PICO beforehand in order to review it and to criticize it if needed. And then a fact check will happen by the health technology developer. And then last step is the publication, followed by a member state's appraisal. So the PICO framework, we are finally there with the key message that I want to bring in this presentation. So PICO stands for Population, Intervention, Comparator, and Outcome. So population, it speaks for itself. When a drug wants to get reimbursed or get a price in Europe, we will first have to look into the population, the patient population for which the drug is addressed. And then the intervention, it is the drug itself. So the technical aspects will be handled in this one. For example, administration routes and the frequency of administration and so on. And then also a comparator will be assigned. This can be a challenge because not every drug is reimbursed in a certain country. So for example, there can be differences between the Belgian and the German list of drugs that are reimbursed. So it is possible that different PICOs will end up in the joint clinical assessment in order to address the needs of several member states. And then lastly, the outcome will also be taken into account, as was also done up to now on a national level. So it should reflect the member states' needs, as I have just mentioned. So it is possible that multiple PICOs will be formulated. And it is also very important to note that a PICO cannot be driven based on the data which is available, but it should be driven based on a policy need. So if there is a certain question, so for example, a gene therapy wants to enter into the market, but there is a lot of uncertainty about the long-term effects, then we should not look at, we should look at the data that is available, but we should not base the PICO on the data that is available, but we should do it the other way around. We should base us on the policy needs, so the question we have to ask and the question that needs to be answered, and then look for what data is fit to answer that question. And that is a very important aspect that is frequently highlighted. So because PICO, I just touched upon the data which is needed. So therefore, we also are doing some research into the current real world evidence and the real data generation through an analysis of documents from Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, in order to see what is currently being done and how can we improve ourselves, or how can we align better into the evidence requirements that will be asked by the joint clinical assessments. So this is very exciting to see in the upcoming years, and it is nice to have this HTAi regulation in place, and hopefully we can guide and assist the preparation phase by handing out the needed information. So, and then lastly, I want to touch up on the European Access Academy, which I and a colleague of mine are now currently part of. And this is an organization which is established since the entry into force of the joint clinical assessments, and they want to address certain challenges for the stakeholders which are involved in the HTMP and the HTR regulation. So it is very exciting. So something that you should really look into. And they will work from a bottom-up perspective, where they look into the HTAi perspective and the most controversial HTAi procedures across Europe, and trying to align these in order to prepare for the early dialogues that were previously mentioned by my colleagues. And then they also have a top-down view on the matters, into that the health technology, health policy perspective is covered, and they look into the key market access trends in order to see where the joint clinical assessments can be fit. So this was the presentation. I would welcome everyone to ask questions or send them through the email address. And I would like to hand over the words to my supervisor, Isabelle Huys.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Thomas. Thanks a lot, Alessandra, for your very insightful presentations on the market access of ATMPs. Indeed, we have some questions in the question and answer box, which I can already answer a little bit, but maybe which is also important to discuss upon. But maybe I can also ask some other questions which I might have to, let's say, start the discussion. Alessandra, Maybe a question to you with respect to transparency. There are a lot of opportunities, you say, or a lot of positive elements linked to the fact. Maybe Thomas, you could stop sharing and we can see the speakers. Then there are, let's say, advantages as well for making management agreements more transparent. But what are then the main challenges related to that?
I think the main challenge lies with the companies, because the companies are often reluctant to share data that could be competitive or that could be used by other companies as a competitive advantage, but also regarding the price. So companies often try to conceal the prices that are really paid under the terms of the agreements, because the list prices or the prices that are public are usually used between countries as a reference price to set the price in a newly reimbursed country. So of course the pharmaceutical company does not want it to be known if there is a discount given in one country, because then other countries will use that also to increase their negotiation power and to ask for lower prices from those companies. So I think that's the most difficult parts in those negotiations, the lack of transparency on the pricing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And is that an issue in all countries, or is Belgium there uniquely positioned in this issue, maybe?
I think it's an issue in all countries. All countries struggle with this. Therefore, for instance, for orphan drugs, which are intended for rare diseases, there are discussions on maybe whether there is a possibility to negotiate jointly with several countries. I think the Benelux that you mentioned is one of those initiatives that might progress to joint price negotiations, but yeah, this is, I think, very, very early to say that.
Yeah, and I don't know, Alessandra, whether you have a question for Thomas or whether I can ask a question.
Yeah, if you have a question.
Yeah, Thomas. So this joint clinical assessment reports, which will then be created. So it's actually, the point is that at the European level, then instead of at the national level, an assessment on the clinical outcomes will be made, and countries will take that up. Do you think the value of having such, let's say, European-wide clinical assessment available?
Yeah, I think it's first I have to note that it is a recommendation to use the joint clinical assessment, so the clinical phase, and countries will not be complied to use it. They are completely open to make use of them. But I think it's a very good thing in order to align the member states and align on the data requirements. It will also hopefully advance and accelerate patient access, because companies will be able to know early on, next to the early dialogues that are performed, they know early on what country will, so it's not the case that they will have to know what country will need what data, but it will be on a European level that the data requirements will be set out, so they can already in the beginning phases of the development design their studies in order to capture the data that is needed on a European level, which will comply to most of the member states' visions about the health technology in order to assess it. And then indeed, sometimes it might be possible that countries ask for complementary data, as I have shared in my presentation. And then it will be upon the country to see what requirements are additionally needed and what for. I think it's important that we move towards really telling why we need that additional data. For example, why do we need to have that context-specific data for a certain country rather than the harmonized view from the European level. Good.
There is another question with respect to the Benelux initiative. Why is the Benelux initiative not expanded to the whole of Europe for joint price negotiations? Alessandra, do you want to ask or answer something like that?
I think because it's easier to start small. I know there's also the Finose cooperation, which is a little bit the same as Benelux, but then between the more Nordic countries. And there I also know that it's already difficult to align with a couple of companies. And also you need to align with companies that with countries that have a similar healthcare structure as yours, I think. So yeah, I think there needs to be a lot of practice and slow, continuous growth for it to become more global.
Indeed, I agree. And I think you need in first these initiatives with countries with a similar healthcare systems or culture might group their efforts on joint discussions and joint negotiations, but afterwards, or maybe in parallel, these, let's say, small initiatives or these focused initiatives might talk to each other, learn from each other, and maybe grow indeed further on the long run, as Alessandra says. And there is another question. Don't you think that the European negotiations and price, as we did for COVID, may be an option? I think the Benelux is going that direction. I think this is a little bit similar to the previous question. Although with COVID vaccines, we went really far at the European level. We did it actually completely at the European level in terms of providing access to these medications. A country was therefore as well buying and for the whole country immediately all these vaccines and so forth. So that was a very unique approach, I can say. Is this the way to go? I think it's definitely worthwhile to explore this further, and definitely certain European actions or European negotiation efforts that were installed at that time are very valuable to consider as well in the context of ATMPs. I'm not sure whether the others want to add here. No. There is another question. Will there be defined timelines for the EU HTAi process or for the PICO work?
Yeah, I think I can answer that one. Yes, there are defined timelines, and you can look them up on the UNETA website as well. And for the timelines, for the time being, so we're in the preparatory phase, so methodologies are still being developed and looked into in order to see what methodology is fit for a certain question. And up to 2025, the work will focus on oncology products next to ATMPs. And then from January 2028 on, orphan medicinal products will also be addressed in the joint clinical assessments. And then after that, so the timeline is 2030, I think. And then all medicinal products will be assessed through the joint clinical assessments. And it's important to note that drugs that are applying now are not obliged to be in the joint clinical assessment framework yet. It is only 2 years after that it will be completely implemented and used.
Maybe I take also a question which I answered in the chat already, but maybe where Alessandra and Thomas could have a different view upon. So a few patients have received their treatments for more than 20 years without known long-term issues or loss of efficacy. How much is needed to prove long-term risks and benefits? Is there another view upon that, Alessandra?
Yeah, I think that's also an important question. How much data is enough? But I think for a drug that's been reimbursed for a long time, long-term benefits and efficacy is quite certain. I think there should be not much of an issue, especially if there are patients that are really benefited from those treatments. I think we also need to be pragmatic and let those be reimbursed.
Yeah. And I have answered that indeed, that it depends on the type of uncertainties that are remaining. And some of these uncertainties might be solved indeed on the short run, and others take a little bit longer. 20 years seems really long indeed. Then indeed, we have also some medications where certainties, where medications are still classified as having some uncertainties unless the practice shows that these uncertainties have been taken away. And at that point in time, I think it's important to move or to make it public also that these uncertainties are removed. And that may also influence the reimbursement status sometimes of that medication. And you are right that attention should go also to that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I maybe want to build on that. You can keep on collecting data and making the uncertainty go away as much as possible. But there's a certain point where it is not more economically viable to collect even more data, because you already see that the uncertainties are addressed well enough. And it is indeed, as Isabelle has already answered, a trade-off which has to be made by clinicians as well in the clinical practice, and to see what level of data is enough. And we could collect data for a lifetime, but if it is already visible in short term that we have enough data that address the needs and the uncertainties, why would we collect and keep on collecting and putting money into collecting additional data if we already know the answer? There's a certain where we have to be pragmatic, as Alessandra.
Yeah. Another question: how does the market access inform the design or the development of the product already, even in the preclinical and subsequent clinical phase? Well, the moment that a product is in the market access phase, the clinical phase or the preclinical phase have already been occurred, so it will not influence their own preclinical and clinical phase. However, knowing what are requirements or conditions or questions that pop up at the market access phase, typically for ATMPs, may inform the development plans of other subsequent ATMP developers. If it is known that at the market access phase, it is very important to prove what the patient perspectives are with respect to particular endpoints, yes, then you need at the end be able to present these endpoints. So then subsequent developers might think about that type of information in selecting their clinical trial endpoints, for instance. But maybe my colleagues can also shed a light on this issue. Alessandra.
Yeah,
I can also step in. So I want to build on Isabelle's answer. Indeed, the market access can inform the preclinical or the design and development of clinical studies in that way that EMA is addressing the benefits, risks, and the safety of the drug. But in the market access, we will also look into the relative effectiveness towards comparators which are already on the market, or other technologies which address a certain population, patient population. So in that way, the market access and it can already inform clinical phases in order to design them in the right way, in order to address the needs of the regulators, so from EMA, as well as the needs from HTAi bodies into collecting data, collecting evidence, which will be of use when addressing the PICO, for example, in order to see what is really needed to involve the patient's perspective as well, as this is more and more important. Also to look at the patient perspective or the caregiver perspective, into these therapies rather than only the clinical effectiveness, which were previously done in clinical trials. So market access can really, when we already know the questions which we'll be asking market access, we can already address them by collecting the right data upfront. So that way it can shape the design of studies.
Yeah. Alessandra?
Yeah, I maybe also have a question for you, Thomas, because we were talking about conditional reimbursements. So if there's a joint HTAi between the different countries, but there's not enough data to provide a definitive reimbursement, are there also provisions made for a shared reevaluation, sharing of outcomes, data, qualis to do the reevaluation after a couple of years? Or will that still be like individual in each country?
Like the appraisal phase is an individual process, so each country can decide for themselves. But I'm not fully aware if there are some mechanisms into place in the way that they think also to reassess certain drugs. And as I have looked into UNETA, I think so that they will address these questions because every country faces these challenges. So I think it will also be something that they will look into the methodology development in this preparatory phase in order to address these reassessments.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we can take some last question. Is there anyone from the audience that has another question? Then it is the moment to type it in or to say it loud and clear here in the meeting. Otherwise, I can here go towards the early dialogue we spoke about, the importance of it, and are we referring to clinical phase 2? Indeed, so have companies talking with regulators that in the end need to assess their medications, that there is always a delicate point or and especially a procedure needed that makes these dialogues being possible and also in an open and transparent and comfortable way. And EMA has installed several procedures to have early dialogues as well, indeed at the level of phase 2 clinical trials. Think of scientific advice, which can be asked by companies during the clinical development phases, which are in some instances very expensive, but which are in a sense early dialogues. There are other ways where companies can come into dialogue with EMA, for instance, the innovative, the ITF, so a platform where also academics can talk with EMA. It would also be good that early dialogues are also possible between payers and companies. That is not so routinely installed yet. And that is maybe something which can be very highly and beneficial for the future. But maybe Alessandra or Thomas, when talking about managed entry agreements, I'm wondering whether some issues could already be clarified earlier on than only at that negotiation phase. What do you think?
I actually agree. I think and I think the companies are also asking for an early dialogue and an opportunity to discuss with the reimbursement or HTAi agency. But as I understand, there is this resource issue, time constraints that don't always make it possible for the companies and the HTAi agency or reimbursement agency to sit together and really go through the data and to see where later on there might be some problems posing. And I don't know, Thomas, maybe the alignments between EMA and reimbursement agencies.
Yeah, I think the alignment is key in early dialogues, to sit around, not with everyone around the table at once, but sit around with different parties in the beginning phases and to have spillovers between regulatory and HTAi bodies. And I will answer.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I think we come at the end of our webinar. I think more, especially the speakers here, Thomas and Alessandra, for giving here this interesting talk. I think also Loranne from the EATRIS and Advanced Project. And I think also all other partners of the Advanced Project, but especially also you all attendees at this webinar. So for joining, this webinar is recorded. The recording will be made available. It is also the last webinar, technical webinar, that you all have been listening to. So thanks as well, and I wish you a very nice end of the year in name of all of us. Thank you. Bye-bye.